Hi everyone and welcome along to the Spring Wreath Kit tutorial. Thank you so much for joining me, whether that's because you've ordered kits or because you're just here for a little bit of creative relaxation. I'm going to show you how to create the most beautiful spring wreath. I promise you, when I show you how, it's so simple, so easy. Just follow step by step and create something beautiful for your door. So in your wreath kits, you will have a variety of abundant, beautiful seasonal foliage. You will have some gorgeous spring bulbs that can go in your wreath kit and then be planted in the garden afterwards when the spring is over for next spring. You will have some sphagnum moss, and you'll have everything you need to do your kit and to make it look stunning. So in your boxes, you will have some pistache foliage. You will have some lovely kind of Phalaspy foliage, which has got sort of little delicate white flowers at the end. You'll have some pittosporum. You'll have some Ralphie, some parvifolia, which is a type of eucalyptus, and then some limonium as well, which is this white sort of floral that dries out beautifully and lasts for ages. You'll also have 4 pots of bulbs, which include white muscari, blue muscari, and a gorgeous sort of lemony, buttery yellow sort of narcissi bulb with a sort of slightly darker centre, stunning for spring. You'll also have your sphagnum moss, which goes onto your metal wreath frame. You'll have your binding wire, which ties it all in together. You'll have your little wires, which we'll use to attach the bulbs to your wreath. And you'll have some twine, which you use to hang it on your door. Okay, let's begin. So I'm going to move out of the way the wires so they don't get lost. Put them to the side. And what we're going to do to start with is we're going to cut down our foliages. So we'll start with this pittosporum here. We're just going to take small sections and just cut them down and put them in a pile. So you're looking at sort of maybe 5 inches, just where the stem meets a set of leaves. So you can get as much out of each stem as possible. So this foliage is a really lovely tonal green. It's not sort of limey, it's not too dark. It's a gorgeous sort of spring tone. So just cutting it down into sections. And if you get sections that aren't quite so sort of aesthetically pleasing, that's fine, that can go at the back of the wreath. So just keep those in your pile anyway. Nearly there on the pittosporum, and then we'll move on to our next foliage. So this is called Ralphie. It's another type of pittosporum actually. It's a beautiful kind of two-tone foliage, so you've got sort of a more of a grey sort of silver side and then more of a tonal green on the other side, so it adds a really lovely texture to your wreath. So with that, we're going to do the same thing, cut it down into sort of sections that are about this sort of size, so maybe about 5 inches. You can do some longer ones if that's where you feel that it meets the sort of the next set of leaves. That's absolutely fine. And don't worry if you've got a big sort of chunky stem like this, you can still use that. Again, it can go in the back of the wreath, so you won't necessarily see where you've cut, but it will provide that sort of body and that kind of depth for your wreath. So don't throw those kind of bits away. Keep them in your piles. So nearly done on the Ralphie. Okay, so that's the Ralphie cut down, and now we'll move on to the Eucalyptus parvifolia. Now this is a really stunning foliage. It's really sort of quite rustic, whimsical. It's got lovely movement. It doesn't smell quite so strongly of the sort of typical eucalyptus, but it's really delicate, and it really adds to a sort of a spring wreath feel. So with this, again, you're cutting it down in sort of sections like this, so aiming for sort of this sort of length. So I'd say that's sort of 5 or 6 inches, and then pop that in your pile. So you're snipping where the stem meets the next set of leaves. So that just gives us sort of a nice, neat finish. It just means that then you're not left with a sort of a section of stem above a set of leaves. So I'll show you again on that bit so that you can see what I mean. So if, for example, I take this piece here, I would cut it above a set of leaves here, so that you're not sort of wasting anything, but you're also not meaning that you've got sort of a big piece of stem above a set of leaves. It means that you get the most out of all of your foliage, so as much of it ends up in the wreath rather than in the bin. I'm going to keep that bit, even though again it's not particularly pretty. You know, there are some bits where I've cut, but that can go at the back of a posy on the wreath, so you won't notice it, but it will add that sort of depth and that volume in your wreath. Okay, nearly there on the parvifolia. And again, much like the sort of the Christmas wreath kits that we did in 2024, there's a real abundance of foliage in your kits. We want them to feel luxurious. We want them to feel lush and abundant. So you've got some really gorgeous sort of elements in your kits for spring. Okay, so that's the parvifolia done and popped in a pile, and then we'll move on to the limonium, or statice is more of a sort of a common name for it. Now this is a really sort of good floral for wreaths because it dries out beautifully, it doesn't lose the colour, and yeah, it works really well. So you're just kind of cutting sections again, you know, sort of 5-6 inches, and popping them in your pile. And for the limonium or statice, we're kind of after, excuse me, just little sections, just little dots of it around your wreath. We don't want it to be the main event, because then it looks sort of splodgy, for want of a better word, but it just means that you're just having little touches of the white dotted amongst your wreath. So just looking for sections, that kind of length. Okay, so that's your limonium done. Pop that in the pile. And now we'll move on to the Thalaspi. Now this is one of my favourites. It's also called green bells, and that's the more common name for it. It's just a stunning foliage with these tiny little delicate white flowers at the end. It just provides a beautiful sort of element of texture and yeah, movement to your wreath. So we're just going to cut this down into sort of small sections. And again, much like the status, this is just a sort of an element of your wreath kit that's just as touches. So you'll probably only put sort of one of these in each of your posies, which will become clear in a minute, because it just adds that slight little bit of texture. So just cutting it down into little sections like so. Nearly there. Takes a bit of time, this beginning bit where you're cutting everything down. Okay, so that is the last bead all cut down and ready and in our pile. And then we're going to go in with the pistache. So the pistache you have 2 bunches of, one big bunch. And the purpose of this foliage is to really, not only is it, personally, I really like it, and I think it's a really beautifully textured foliage and lasts really well outdoors in a wreath, but it's also a really good filler foliage. So it creates a really good amount of sort of texture, but also body to your wreath. So your wreath will feel more abundant with it in, even though it won't necessarily be at the forefront of your wreath. It will be behind, possibly, because these are probably the more showy foliages, and the florals obviously, and then the bulbs. But this is a great filler foliage, and it really creates a gorgeous texture. So we're going to cut this down and put it into a pile. So you're looking at sections, again, about 5 or 6 inches. So nothing too long, but not too short. Just don't go too short, because obviously we can't rectify that. But if you cut something too long, you can always trim it down a little bit. So we're just going for sort of sections like that. And again, if you get a section like this where you can see I've trimmed it already, you can still use this bit. We'll cut it here, and I'll still use it. It will just sit in the back of the wreath. This foliage will definitely take you the longest amount of time to cut down. But once we've got all of our foliages in the sort of bundles, it's much quicker and it flows much more smoothly once this is all done. And we can get on to the more exciting parts. Nearly there. Okay, last couple. Okay, we're there, finally. The pistache is done. Excuse me. So I'm going to move all this over to this side. Excuse me. And then we are finally there on our foliage. Okay, so the next stage is to moss up. So you're going to take your binding wire and just pull a little length out, just a couple of inches. And you're going to attach it to your copper wreath ring and wind it round a few times round one of the sort of, usually probably the outer ring. Okay, you're then going to go out and over and then back under in a sort of zigzag pattern, pulling it quite taut. And the purpose of this is so that your moss has something to sit on. It sort of creates a structure so the moss doesn't fall through. So all the way around, the zigzag pattern. And holding it quite tight. And then you don't take off your binding wire until right at the end. So leave your binding wire on, attached to your wreath ring until I tell you to cut it. Okay, and in your kits you will have a big bag of sphagnum moss. Now this is fresh living moss. It's not the most beautiful, but you won't see it on your wreath. The purpose is to provide a little bit of moisture to your sort of living ingredients, and that will keep them fresher for longer. So by keeping your moss damp for as long as you can, and I'll go through all the care for your wreath at the end, but by keeping it nice and damp, you will prolong the life of your wreath. It's also obviously important for your bulbs as well, so that's where they will get their sort of water source from. Okay, so you're going to take big sort of handfuls of your sphagnum moss. You're going to lay it on top of where you've just done your zigzag pattern. You're going to hold it tight on top of your wreath ring, and then you're just going to bind it on. So going up and over. And you can be quite generous with your moss. You've got plenty in your kits. Again, we just want to create a really full, sort of abundant and lush wreath. So we've given you lots and lots of moss. You'll find all sorts of things in it. Like you might have pine cones in there, you'll have twigs in there, roots in there. It adds a really lovely kind of texture to your wreath. When you look at it sort of from the side, I mean, you won't really see it at all, but just from, you know, you might get that odd bit of moss poking through, which I think just looks lovely. And this moss is really wet, so it will keep the wreath really fresh for as long as possible. If you want to work out how much moss you want to use and how much is in your kit, you can lay it all on first and then sort of bind around, but I do it sort of a handful at a time. But just make sure you're nice and generous with it, because if you do too little moss, you will end up with quite a sort of, I guess, thin or sort of shallow wreath is probably the best way to describe it. So by having a really nice, dense, thickly mossed wreath ring, you will end up with a really nice sort of abundant wreath. I've got plenty left over, so I probably could have been more generous with it, but I think it's fine. Okay, so again, don't take your binding wire off, leave that on. Oops, tickle. Leave it on your wreath, don't cut it off. Just going to add a tiny bit more there. If you find you have done it too thin because you didn't want to run out, I mean, I can assure you won't. You can go round again if you want to. You can put it, you know, on again and then rebind and do like another layer. But for me, that is plenty of moss. But yeah, you can always put more on if you want to. Okay, so now we can get started on creating our wreath. Now, I am right-handed and my brain works in a way that I'm going to go round my wreath in a clockwise motion. Now, this is the main sort of piece of advice that I would give anyone making a wreath. It's the way to make it look as professional as possible and as beautiful and as sort of structured and as sort of like there's intent there, is to create a wreath going in the same motion. So you're either going to put your posies, which will become clear in a minute, in a clockwise motion, or if you work the other way, you will do them in an anti-clockwise sort of motion. So I am right-handed, so my binding wire is coming out into the center of my wreath ring from the left-hand side of my wreath. So I would say the best thing, the way sort of analogy to work with is a clock. So you've got 12, 1, 6 and 9. So my binding wire is at 9 o'clock on my wreath ring. And that's where I'm going to start. So to start sort of constructing your wreath, we're going to create some beautiful little posies using our foliages. The bulbs come in later. So let's start. So you're going to create posies. You're probably going to create about 11 or 12 little posies that form your wreath. So I'm going to take 3 pieces of the pistache. That's the one where you've got the most of it. That will go at the back. And then I'm going to add in a couple of pieces of the pistache. I'm then going to add in some parvifolia. So I'm going to do 2 pieces of that. I'm going to add in 2 stems of the laspi, and then I'm going to pop 1 piece of the statice on top. I'm going to see how I'm actually going to count how many statice I have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So I've got enough, I think, for 1 piece per posy. Now I feel like I want that to be a little bit denser, so I'm actually going to add another couple of pieces of pistache to the back. So you've got your little first posy ready to go on your wreath where your binding wire is attached. So my binding wire is attached at 9 o'clock on my wreath ring. I'm going to hold my posy in my left hand, as I'm right-handed, and I'm going to hold it sort of coming down it. So I'm not holding it like this. I'm holding it, I'm changing my grip like this. So I've almost got it sort of up, I'm holding my hand sort of upside down almost. And I'm going to lay it at the 9 o'clock part of my wreath ring, pointing round. So I'm just laying it on top of where my binding wire is attached to my wreath ring. And with this hand, I'm then going to grab my wreath ring so that I've kind of got my posy and my wreath ring sort of in one hand. And then I'm going to take my binding wire and really tightly and assertively, don't worry, you're not going to break anything. I'm going to go up and over 3 times. Underneath, pull, up and over, underneath, pull, up and over, underneath, pull. So it's nice and tight. So if you're going to slam that front door, you know it's not going to fall off. I'm then going to, this is a really crucial step, I'm then going to lay it down. I'm going to take my hands away. Okay, you've got your binding wire just underneath your first posy. I'm then going to twist the wreath. Please don't forget to do this. It's really important. It will keep everything sort of quite straight in your mind as to the direction you're going. So I've laid it back down and then twisting it until those 3 sort of loops of binding wire are at 9 o'clock again on my wreath kit, on my wreath ring, sorry. So you've got 12, 3, 6, 9. I think I called that 1 earlier on. That's bad. 12, 3, 6, 9. So at 9 o'clock, that is where your 3 binding wire sort of loops are, and that's where your new posy is going to go. Okay, so let's go in with another posy. So I'm going to take 3 pieces of pistache. I'm going to take a couple of pieces of the pistache, a couple of pieces of the parvifolia, 1 piece of the statice, and then a couple of stems of the philosophy. Okay, I'm going to change my grip to that way. I'm going to lay that down on top of the 3 loops of binding wire, slightly pointing out, slightly. So if you watch, as you see in the video, it sort of slots in. Okay, so you're sort of slotting it on top. You're then going to hold the wreath ring and your posy together, and you're going to bind 3 times, nice and assertively, nice and tight. Pull the wire as you're going under. So 3 times, and then going to pop the binding wire down and the wreath ring down, and then I'm going to twist. So again, my 3 loops of binding wire are at 9 o'clock on my wreath ring clock face. So you've got 12, 3, 6, 9. So 9 o'clock, and as you can now start to see, these 2 posies are both facing in a clockwise motion. So if you imagine it's going around, it's going to follow that kind of pattern. So you've not got one that's sort of pointing that way, one pointing that way, one pointing that way. This is what creates a beautiful professional looking wreath, and I think it's what's going to make you realise how sort of simple it is to create one at home when you know how to. So just following that motion. If your brain sort of works the other way around, something in my eye, you would go the opposite way, but instead of working from like a 9 o'clock on your clock face, you work from a 3 o'clock. So every time you point that way and then you twist and you'd put the new one at 3 o'clock. Okay, so we've got our binding wire at 9 o'clock. I'm going to create another new posy. So I've got my pistache. I'm going to do 4 pieces here because they're all relative. I might do 5. There's all relatively sort of small sections. So I've got a nice sort of lush amount of that foliage. I'm then going to add in my pistache. I'll pop in 3 bits of this now. And then I'm going to add 2 pieces of my parvifolia. And as you can see, it just adds that sort of really lovely movement. 2 sections of the philosophy, and then 1 of the statice. I've got my little posy there. I'm going to swap my grip. I'm going to lay my posy on top at 9 o'clock, on top of the previous posy, on top of the binding wire of the previous posy, like so. I'm then going to hold it nice and tight with my wreath ring, and I'm going to wrap around, over and under 3 times. I'm going to cut this bit of root off, it's in the way. And then laying my wreath ring back down, and then I'm twisting. So that my binding wire is at 9 o'clock. Excuse me. And now for the new posy. It's all looking lovely and textured and full. So 3 pieces of pistache there, 2 pieces of pittosporum, 2 stems of the parvifolia, 2 of the philosophy, and then 1 of the lemonian. Okay, I'm going to change my grip, and I'm going to lay it on top of my previous posy, and the wire that's bound my previous posy onto my wreath ring, 9 o'clock. I'm going to pop it straight on. You see how it slots on top. I'm going to hold onto my posy and my wreath ring in one hand, so in my left hand. Obviously, if you were doing it this side and you would say left-handed, you'd be holding it in your right hand. And I'm going to wrap 3 times, pulling nice and tight. And I'm going to lay that down, and then I'm going to twist. So my binding wire is back at 9 o'clock. Okay. Let's start with another posy. So I'm going to go for 3 bits of pistache. Oh my goodness, I've just realised I've forgotten one of the foliages. Okay. 2 secs. You won't do this, so you don't need to copy me, but I'm just going to slot this in. Ah, sorry. Right. I forgot the Ralphie. One of the best bits. Okay, that's fine. I think we're saved. Right, let's start with this posy, and this one we will include the Ralphie. So 2 of the pittosporum, include 1 of the Ralphie, 2 of the parvifolia, and then 2 of the philosophy, and then 1 of the status. So I've got my posy here. I'm changing my grip. I'm laying it on top of my binding wire from my previous posy. I'm slotting it in there, holding both in one hand, and over 3 times. And twist. So we have our binding wire at 9 o'clock on our wreath ring. Okay, let's make another posy, and we'll remember the Ralphie again in this one. Two pittosporum, Ralphie, parvifolia, so 2 sections of that. 2 of the philosophy, and then move that back, 1 of the status. Okay, so I'm going to change my grip, laying it on top of the binding wire of the previous posy, so it slots in. I'm going to hold the wreath ring and the posy at the same time together in one hand, and wrap round 3 times, up and over and under, really nice and tight. I'm going to lay it back down, and then I'm going to twist. Okay, we're now probably 2/3 through, so you can start to see sort of how much foliage you might have left. I wouldn't advise getting to this point and thinking, oh, I'm going to add loads more into my posies, because then you will end up with a lopsided wreath. I would go with kind of what I've suggested, you know, sort of 3 of the pistache. If you've got small sections like I have in this posy, for example, I'd go 4, which that's probably enough, 3 or 4. Yeah, so don't sort of start adding loads more foliage in. I think the worst case is that you use the same amount as what I've suggested, and then you use your leftovers for something beautiful like a foliage tablescape or something. Okay, I'm adding in the Ralphie. Now this was the piece that's really not particularly aesthetically pleasing, so I'm actually going to put that at the back. You still get a little bit of the sort of texture there, but I'm just going to add a smaller piece on top. A couple of the parvifolia, and then 2 of the Philasphe, followed by the Status. Okay, I'm going to change my grip, lay it down on top of the previous posie's binding wire, put it nice and tight in one hand, and then wrap round. And I think one of the key things, apart from going in the sort of the same direction for all of your posies, is just to be quite assertive. Like, I have got really, really small hands, and I find it, you know, relatively easy to hold my posy with the wreath ring, and that's with tiny hands. So I think when you're making your wreath, just be really kind of confident and assertive, and just, you know, wrap that binding wire around really nice and tight, because the worst thing is when you've created a beautiful wreath and then you've not wrapped it tight enough, and then you find that things start to fall out. So yeah, just go really, really, just be really confident you can do it. Like, just hold that binding wire like you're a pro, and you won't be disappointed in terms of then things falling out of your wreath. Okay, so I've done 3 sections of pistache there. I'm going to go in with 3 of the pittosporum in this one. Some Ralphie on top. A couple of pieces of the parvifolia. I put 3 in there actually. And then 2 of the Philasphe. Piece of Status. Changing my grip. Oh, I didn't twist. Okay. Got my binding wire now at 9 o'clock. Changing my grip and laying that on top. So slotting that over the top of my binding wire from the previous posy, holding it nice and tight, and wrapping that binding wire around 3 times. Now I think we've probably got 3 or 2.5 maybe. Sorry, pulling that down and twisting, so it's back at 9 o'clock. I think we've got 2 or 3 I think, more posies left to do. Okay. So, a few small pieces of pittosporum and pistaches. I'm going to add, I think there's about 5 there, but they're all quite small. And then a couple of, actually we'll go 3 of the pittosporum, and then we'll go for a Ralphie on top. I'm going to put 1 behind, 2 of the parvifolia, and 2 of the Philasphe. Okay, I'm actually going to trim these stems now as we come to the end, or near the end of our wreath. So I'm just going to take off probably like 1 inch, just to make it a little bit sort of smaller. Changing my grip on top at 9 o'clock of the previous binding wire. So you can see I've forgotten the Status. Add that on top of the previous binding wire. Laying it down, twisting, so you've got your binding wire at 9 o'clock. Okay, so 2 more posies left. So a bunch, 3 stems, maybe 4 of the pistache, 2 of the, or 3 actually, of the pittosporum, 2 of the Ralphie, 2 of the parvifolia. Starts to get messy now. The piles aren't quite so tidy. I've put 3 of the philosophy in here, and then the statice on top. Okay, and then going to trim this section of my posy off, so taking it down so that it's easier to hold and tuck under as we're sort of nearing the end. So I'm going to change my grip, lay that on top of the previous posy. Now I'm thinking that maybe I'm not going to need another, or we'll do probably a half. Okay, and then I'm going to bind round, making sure I'm not sort of tucking any of the first posy's foliages in under my binding wire. So you're kind of almost making sure the binding wire is underneath. So nice and tight. Don't worry about knocking the first posy's foliages around. They're nice and secure on your wreath because you would have bound them really tightly. And then going to twist, so 9 o'clock. So here is my last section. Now, I'm going to do a normal size posy, I think, and really tuck it under. This is probably the trickiest part of the entire wreath. So, I mean, it's not rocket science, don't worry, but it's just probably the little bit more technical. So I'll talk you through it. Okay, I'm going to create a little posy. Now, if you've got a really small space, which I would say mine is quite small there, I'm not going to do a massive posy. I'm going to keep it relatively small, so I'm probably going to go for 2, so 3 of the pistache, 2 of the pittosporum, 2 of the parvifolia. Where's the Ralphie? Have we used it? Oh no. Of Ralphie, 1 stem of Ralphie, 2 philosophy, and then 1 statice. Okay, I'm then going to trim that quite short, so I'm going to take off most of this. So I'm left with a posy that's sort of this size. So I've got my grip the right way. I'm then going to kind of lift the first posy that you put down right at the beginning. Lift that up slightly. And I'm going to tuck the stems of my last posy underneath the first posy. Again, on top of the binding wire from your previous one. I'm going to hold it really tight. Like, you don't need to worry about anything falling off. You can be really assertive. I'm going to hold it really tight. And I'm also going to bind really tight. But as I bind, I kind of tuck the binding wire underneath the first posy. So I'm not flattening or sort of accidentally sort of securing any of the first posy's foliages underneath the binding wire at the end. I'm going to do that 3 times, nice and tight. I'm then going to twist it. Now, I probably wouldn't advise this, but I'm going to do it anyway just so that I can show you what to do. So I'm going to lay it flat, upside down on my table. And this is just how you sort of cast off. So I'm going to trim my binding wire. So it's probably about 3 inches there, 3 or 4 inches. I'm then going to take it and sort of tuck it underneath, almost like a needle and thread, underneath one of the copper sort of rings. So you've got 1, 2. So just choose which one, either the top one or the bottom one. And it's almost like you're sewing to sort of cast off. And then once you've done that, you'll have your little sort of wire left. I bend it back on itself and I just tuck it into the moss. So then it's not going to scratch your door. Okay, and then I'm going to flip it back over and lay that back down. Okay, I'm going to put that back to 9 o'clock, the sort of the last posy, because I think actually what's nice is you can then sort of jig things around a little bit. Everything's been bounded so nice and tight, nothing's going to fall off. So you can just kind of have a little zhuzh or a rearrange so you know it's all looking really gorgeous. And I'm now going to put in my twine. So in your kit, you will have your twine. And this is what we use to hang it on the door. So I've given you a length that's big enough so that you can double it up. So if it's nice and heavy, which it probably will be, you can double up your twine. And then all you do is where you I would suggest where you put your first posy and last posy is where I would then put my twine. So you sort of tuck it under, almost as on top of like a section of binding wire. And then you even it up and then simply tie it in a knot. And then you've got your length twine there, and you can either then tie that together in a knot, and then that creates your sort of twine to go on your front door, and you can then trim that so it's neat. So then if you've got a hook or a knocker, you tie that round there. I wouldn't suggest doing that until you've measured sort of how low down you want it on your door. Okay, so we've got our twine. So our wreath, as it stands, is all made, and now we can add in the bulbs. Okay, right, so pop all your leftover foliage, if you have some, in a pile. Hopefully you can find a home for it. Pop it in some little bud vases, or you know, so even if some little sort of drinking glasses along a table. Okay, and now we're going to do the bulbs. So I'm going to pop my wreath to the side. And this is quite a messy bit. So we're going to take out all of our bulbs out of their pots. So you'll have your white muscari, you'll have your blue muscari, and you'll have your sort of, as I said at the beginning, like buttery yellow narcissi. If you find that they're a bit root bound, that's fine, you just break those up. It's totally safe for them. Okay. They just look stunning. Their root systems are just beautiful. Okay, so all we're going to do now is break up our bulbs into individual bulbs rather than all in one. Don't worry about breaking the roots. As long as they've got some roots, they will be fine. And their roots take the moisture from the atmosphere and the moss. It's probably a really good idea to give your bulbs a good water actually before you start. So it's definitely messy, but quite satisfying. And just while we're doing this, I'll talk you through how you can then replant them in the garden once your wreath has finished. So when your wreath goes over, and what will happen probably is it will dry out. So we have people who have wreaths from us and they keep them on their doors even though they're completely dried out, and they enjoy them and they still look beautiful. So you can do that. But you can also, once your wreath goes over, take your bulbs out of your wreath and let the leaves turn yellow if they haven't already. So allow the leaves of your bulbs to go yellow. This means that all of the nutrients from your bulbs, from the leaves, has gone back into the bulb, and it gives it its best chance of coming back up next spring. So you then, once this has all gone yellow, you then snip it down to the sort of the base of the bulb, or base of the leaves, top of the bulb. You can then just take your wire out of your bulb that we're going to put in a minute, and you simply dig a hole in your garden 3 inches deep, 3 or 4 inches, and you simply pop that bulb in facing up, cover it back with soil, and forget about it. And then next spring you should see some beautiful shoots of muscari, and they can come back up year after year after year. So it's the wreath that keeps on giving. So you'll have approximately 24 bulbs to plant in your garden for next spring. Okay, so we've made a massive mess. So now what we're going to do is put in the wires that are also in your kit. So you'll have 24 green thick wires, and all we do, this seems brutal, it's not, I promise, is we stick it up into the bulb. So you've basically got like a little bulb lollipop, and then pop that in a pile. So in the middle of the bulb, just pop it up by about a centimetre and then pop it to the side. Now I'll go through some care as well, and then I'll recap all of that at the end. But in terms of care of your wreath, so obviously as you've seen, we've put it on a moss base. So you'll have noticed that that moss was damp when it arrived with you in your boxes. So that moss needs to stay as damp as possible. So ideally, if we're having like, you know, a lovely spell with no rain and it's sunny and warm and beautiful, you need to take a jug or even just a bottle of water, and you'll have your wreath on your door, and you simply pour that jug or that bottle behind the wreath. So you're basically watering this. So if you imagine it's on your door, you take your jug and you basically just drench it, and then that just prolongs the life. You can also, you know, water the front really, because it's not going to damage it. If we have rain, you don't need to do that so much, but if you're, you know, if your wreath is on a door that's under a porch or under cover, then I would definitely suggest doing that sort of every kind of maybe 2-3 days, 3 days probably. So you can water the front, you can spritz it if you want to, but it's all about keeping those bulb roots nice and sort of damp. You'll find that they will stay relatively damp anyway from the sort of the moisture in the atmosphere, but if we are having a really lovely spell of weather, then it's always good to water your wreath. You will get much longer out of it. It's worth it. It will then just dry, you know, in a few weeks' time, come what sort of end of Easter, it will have dried out, but it will still look gorgeous. It will still be green. It will just feel a little bit crunchy to the touch, that's all. It will still look stunning. You know, don't feel like you have to rush it off your door. Leave it on, but if you want to take the bulbs off once they have gone yellow, and then you can plant them in your garden. Okay, we'll move on to the narcissi now. So I'm going to take a little bit of that bulb off, the root off, pop that in. So the wire is just going into the base. Okay, so we've had a bit of a clear up, a bit of a sweep, we've got rid of some of the soil, and now we're going to add our bulbs into our wreath. So I'm going to pop the wreath in the middle so you can see. And what we're aiming for is spreading our bulbs throughout the wreath, because as you can see now it's all green and lush, and there's just the tones of white. But once we add the bulbs in and they start to bloom, you will get the tones of blue and the whites and the buttery yellows, and it will look so beautifully spring-like. So I'm going to start adding them in. I'm going to start with the bigger bulbs, which are the narcissi. Okay, so you're going to take your bulb with your wire, and in the direction that you have all of your foliage, all your posies, so for instance, in my case, it's in a clockwise motion, I'm going to point my bulb in the same direction. So I'm just going to lift my wreath slightly, being careful of my hand, which is behind, because I don't want to poke it too hard. And I'm just going to slot that wire into the moss base. You might feel it coming back out the other side, in which case you can just sort of use your fingers to bend it back on itself, just so that you're not going to scratch your door with a wire poking out. And as you can see, it's facing this way. So it's not kind of facing up, it's not kind of, you know, not got one here, one here, one here, one here. It's just still flowing in that beautiful motion, which again will just make your wreath look really lovely and professional. Okay, I'm now going to add in my next narcissi. So I've got 4 in here. You might have 3, but more than likely you'll have 4. Ordinarily, I would say work in triangles, but we've got 4 here, so we're going to work in a square. So I've got 1 here. I'm going to put 1 here, 1 here, and 1 here. So if you imagine it's sort of a square or diamond shape, I suppose, in this angle. So we're spreading them out evenly throughout our wreath. And again, we're putting it in the direction that the wreath is flowing. I probably should have done that at 9 o'clock. I will do that for the next one. So I'm turning my wreath. So the place I'm going to put my narcissi is at 9 o'clock. Those roots are down amongst all that foliage and near the moss base. Can't feel any wire there, so that's fine. Moving it around again to 9 o'clock to put the last one in. So this is the last narcissi going in. And as you can see, it starts to really, oh, that wire's just gone out the other side, so I'm just going to redo that. It doesn't matter though, to be fair, but you'll see all the mud or the soil is kind of coming off, but that will just brush away. Okay, and you can see now starting to create sort of a depth of texture. You've got those browns of that papery sort of bulb, and then you've got the shoots of the florals that are going to bloom, and it just looks gorgeous already. We haven't even got the mascara in yet. Okay, I'm going to start adding in the mascara. So with this, you can just go wherever you want to. You've got so many that it really doesn't matter. You can cluster, which I think always looks lovely. So sort of I'm going to put 3 in together here. So again, I'm working at my 9 o'clock and I'm pointing it in the same direction. Add in my next few. And again, making sure those roots are kind of quite far down in amongst those foliages. And again, like a crucial tip is to make sure you keep your wreath nice and damp. Okay. So again, popping these bulbs in the direction. And as you can see, they're starting to bloom there. And I really do hope that you plant yours in your garden afterwards, because to have these come back year after year is just such a treat. And they will look beautiful next spring. Okay, we've got 4 left. Okay, so now I'm just going to look, see if there's any gaps. I'll pop one here. An abundance of bulbs. Last one. Okay, and the bulbs are all in, so there you have it. So I'm just going to recap the sort of care tips for your wreath. So you want to keep your moss as damp as possible. Just chuck as much water at it as you can, sort of every 3 days maybe. You can do the front of it and the back, but especially the back. Making sure that moss is nice and damp, because that is where your bulbs are going to get their water source from. Obviously it can be outdoors. It doesn't need to be covered by a porch, you know. All the elements can hit it, it will be absolutely fine. It will just dry out, it will stay green but dry out. Your bulbs, let them go yellow, let the leaves go yellow, cut them then, or take them out of your wreath, leave your wreath on the door, take the bulbs out, let the leaves go yellow, cut the leaves down so you've just got your little bulbs. Dig a 3 to 4 inch hole in your garden, in the soil, point your bulb up at the bottom of that hole, cover back up with soil, do that 24 times, and then your bulbs will come back next spring, and spring after spring after spring. But yeah, keep it damp and enjoy those bulbs for years to come. So there you have it, your living spring wreath. I hope you've enjoyed.